Most people, they think they know the story of Christopher Columbus, but I'm going to tell you, you probably don't, because the history books have left this part out. You see, he believed that the end of the world was near, but before Christ could return, he thought several things had to happen first. And wouldn't you know that he would actually play a major role in the fulfillment of these prophecies? It's absolutely amazing. Let's take a look. Some describe Columbus's mission as a quest for wealth and royal favor. Others note that Spain's monarchs hoped new trade routes would help finance their ongoing struggle against Muslim powers that had dominated parts of the Mediterranean and still held on to Jerusalem at that time. What few realize is that none of these motives was, in his own mind, the main reason for his voyage. Rather, Columbus believed he was fulfilling prophecy, biblical prophecy. That conviction was central to his motivation, and amazingly, we are witnessing the prophetic unfolding of his efforts to this very day. In fact, I believe Columbus was used by God to bring about the conditions for Christ's return, and it's truly fascinating stuff. In the final years of his life, ravaged by betrayal and sickness, Columbus compiled a strange document that few history textbooks mention. It was called the Book of Prophecies. Rather than being a list of predictions, it was a compilation of prophecies he believed he was fulfilling. Page after page, he copied out more than 300 scriptures, annotated and arranged to prove that his westward voyage had been preordained by God. This is fascinating stuff, people. Okay, among those texts were verses from the little-known apocryphal book 2nd Esdras, also known as 4th Ezra. Columbus underlined 2nd Esdras 6:42. It says, "On the third day you commanded the waters to be gathered together in a seventh part of the earth. 6 parts you dried up and kept, so that some of them might be planted and cultivated and be of service before you." He took this verse to mean that there had to be undiscovered continents across the western horizon. Now, most Christians today do not consider 2nd Esdras to be canonical scripture. Now, it appears in the Apocrypha of some of the older Bibles, but not in most Protestant ones. Yet Columbus treated it as inspired guidance. And intriguingly, its statement that the earth was divided into 6 parts land and 1 part water is surprisingly close to modern estimates of land to sea ratio, depending on how you count the continents. He also copied 2nd Esdras 13:41 through 45, which tells of the 10 lost tribes of Israel crossing, quote, to a further country where never mankind dwelt, a year and a half's journey, and the same region is called Arsarath. This passage now, it describes an old Jewish belief that after the Assyrian exile of 722 BC, the northern tribes of Israel migrated far beyond the known world, crossing water to reach another land so distant it was said to take a year and a half to reach, a place called Arsarath, which literally means a far-off region. Columbus read this as a literal reference to real habitable lands across the Western Ocean and copied it into his book of prophecies as evidence that scripture itself pointed to undiscovered continents. To him, these ancient lines hinted at lands whose discovery would help him fulfill his role in the biblical timeline, as we'll see in a minute. You see, he believed that the end of the world was near, but before Christ could return, he thought several things had to happen first. And wouldn't you know that he would actually play a major role in the fulfillment of these prophecies? It's absolutely amazing. Let's take a look. Jerusalem at that time was under Muslim control. For centuries, European crusaders had tried and failed to win it back permanently. But Columbus, he had a new strategy: fund the reconquest of Israel using gold and riches from undiscovered lands to the west. And he wasn't alone in that vision. Spain's monarchs, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, had long dreamed of launching a final crusade to liberate the Holy City. They saw Columbus's voyage not just as a chance for wealth, but as a means to a spiritual end. On December 26, 1492, less than 3 months after his famous landfall, Columbus made this ambition plain. In his journal, he wrote that he had urged the Spanish crown to, quote, spend all the profits of this enterprise on the conquest of Jerusalem. A year later, in a letter to the monarchs, he put a number on it. In 7 years, he wrote, I shall give your highness enough money to pay for 5,000 knights and 50,000 foot soldiers for the war and conquest of Jerusalem. You see, he believed that his discoveries were the key to retaking the holy city, and that retaking the holy city was the key to fulfilling prophecy. But what prophecy was he referring to? Glad you asked. At the heart of his belief was a conviction rooted in Scripture, that the Messiah could not return until the temple in Jerusalem was built. This idea has ancient roots. In fact, the prophet Isaiah wrote of a day when the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and all nations shall flow unto it. Daniel spoke of a holy place anointed at the end of 70 weeks, which is a timeline that has been associated with the end of days. Zechariah foresaw a future day when the Lord would return to Jerusalem, dwell in the midst of Zion, and all nations would come to worship him there. To many medieval and Renaissance Christians, these verses pointed to a literal third temple that must one day rise again in Jerusalem. Columbus believed that his journey had kick-started this process. And part of that plan, in his view, included spreading the gospel throughout the world. You see, by bringing the gospel westward, he was helping to fulfill the words of Christ in Matthew 24:14, which says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." In other words, first, the gospel must go out, then Jerusalem must be liberated, then the temple rebuilt, then the Messiah would return. To Columbus, this was a divine timeline, and he thought God was using him to bring it about. Many might think that he was just being boastful in his role in the end times, but he wasn't. In fact, he called himself a, quote, most unworthy sinner, claiming that only by God's grace had he been chosen for this task. Yet he was utterly confident that his voyage had been foreseen. And I believe he was right, and I think you will too if you stick around to the end. In his book of prophecies, he quoted Isaiah 55:5, a promise that distant nations would be drawn to God's chosen servant. He copied out Psalm 2:8, where God tells the Messiah, "Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance," seeing it as a pledge that Christ's kingdom would one day extend across the globe. He cited the Gospels and the prophets with the same expectation that the gospel had to reach every people group. His sources even included ancient Greek writers like Seneca, who spoke of a new world emerging at the end of time. Seneca wrote, "These lines have been translated to suggest a future time when the ocean would reveal a great land and new worlds." Many, like Columbus, believed Seneca had foretold the discovery of the new world 1,400 years before the event. To many in our modern world, it might sound ridiculous, similar to how the world mocks us Christians who still believe we're living in prophetic times. But to Columbus, it was providence. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Like many in his time, Columbus believed the world would last exactly 7,000 years, following an interpretation of Scripture that traced back to the earliest church fathers. They saw the 7 days of creation not only as a literal week, but as a prophetic outline of world history. 6 millennia of toil, followed by a 7th millennium of rest, corresponding to the Sabbath. Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century, taught that in as many days as this world was made, in so many thousand years shall it be concluded. He cited Genesis, he cited Psalm 90 verse 4, which says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past." And he also cited Revelation 20's 1,000-year reign of Christ as evidence. Lactantius, writing in the 3rd and 4th century, taught the same idea. 6,000 years of history, followed by a 1,000-year kingdom of peace. Now, Columbus, he picked up on this tradition and ran with it. In the book of prophecies, he calculated that the world was 5,343 years and 318 days old when Christ was born. Now, at the time of him writing his book of prophecies, around 1501, it had been 1,501 years since, which meant the world was approaching 6,844 years old on his prophetic timeline. Only 155 years remained, in his view, until the 7,000-year limit expired. In other words, he believed he was living in the final stretch, the last chapter before the return of Christ. And he saw his voyages, his discoveries, and even his hardships as part of that divine countdown. But here's where the story becomes truly amazing. Columbus, he never funded the conquest of Jerusalem. He never saw the temple rebuilt. In fact, he died in relative obscurity, stripped of his titles, buried without fanfare, likely confused as to what God meant for him. So you have to ask, were his prophecies failed prophecies? Not so fast. Something did happen. The world he discovered would one day become a launching pad for global Christianity. The spread of the gospel across North and South America would give rise to missionary movements, revivals, and Bible translations in hundreds of languages. More than that, the land he claimed for Spain would, centuries later, become the United States of America. And in 1948, it was the United States, led by President Harry Truman, that became the first nation to recognize the reborn state of Israel. So just think about how crazy that is. Columbus believed he was on a mission. He believed he was fulfilling prophecy. It didn't happen in his lifetime, but 500 years later, we are on the brink of all of it coming true. In fact, many of his prophecies, or at least his predictions, or whatever you want to call them, have come true. The land he discovered became the very land that became the nation that literally led the initiative to bring Israel back to its homeland. And now Israel is on the brink of building its temple, just as Columbus had hoped for. Without him, it's possible America would never have risen as it did. Without America, the rebirth of Israel in 1948 becomes far less likely. And without Israel, the prophetic stage on which the third temple might appear would not exist. Columbus believed the world was nearing its end, and in many ways, his journey helped set the stage for things we're still watching unfold. Now, none of this would have made sense to Columbus. He wouldn't have known what to make of presidents or UN votes or fighter jets defending Tel Aviv. Yet the very scriptures he drew from, Psalm 2:8, Isaiah 55:5, and those haunting passages of 2nd Esdras, kept alive his conviction that God's plan would unfold. I just think this story is absolutely fascinating. I wanted to share it with you today. And, I hope it blesses you and helps you grow in your faith. I think it's amazing, the history of Christianity. Anyway, please like, subscribe, share, and in the meantime, take care and God bless.